Hello and welcome to the Green Room podcast. I'm your host, Garon Green, and this episode means something to me personally because grief isn't something I only understand through counselling theories I've worked on, books, or sitting alongside other people. I understand something of grief through my own life. I've experienced people I love no longer being there, and I've experienced that strange reality of life continuing around when something inside your own world has fundamentally changed. One thing my own experiences have taught me is that grief doesn't always look the way people expect it to look. Sometimes it can be tears, anger, silence. Sometimes you're functioning, you go to work, you laugh, you speak to people, and nobody looking at you would necessarily know what you're carrying underneath. And sometimes grief appears in the smallest moment: a song, a photograph, a smell, a place, an anniversary. I need to tell them about this. And then you remember, I think grief can create a dividing line in somebody's life. There was a person you were before, and then there's the person trying to understand who they are afterwards. And as a counsellor, I also simply, as somebody who has experienced loss myself, I've become very cautious about telling another person what their grief should look like. There isn't one correct way. There isn't a stopwatch. There isn't a point where somebody else gets to decide. You should be over this now. People often desperately want help, so reach out for words. Stay strong. Everything happens for a reason. You got to move forward. Normally those words come from a good place, but sometimes the most compassionate thing that we can do isn't to find the perfect words. Sometimes it's just to stay, to listen, to let somebody say the name of the person they miss, to let them tell the story again, and perhaps simply communicate. You don't have to pretend you're okay with me. So that's the conversation I want to have today. Not an academic lecture about grief, not a checklist, not somebody telling you how you're supported to heal. I want to understand the human being inside the experience, what happens to identify after loss, what happens to the future we thought we were going to have, and how do we carry memories without feeling that we have to live permanently in the past? And how do we eventually laugh again without feeling guilty? And perhaps one of the biggest questions, how do we continue living without believing that continued means being loved, and that brings me to today's guest. I'd like to introduce Doug Lawrence, and Doug has spent more than 3 decades in mentoring and leadership. He is an international certified mentor, an author, an educator whose work has centered around monitoring mental health, human connection, and the importance of one person genuinely being present for another. Doug is an author of The Gift of Mentoring, You Are Not Alone, and his latest book, which I'm really keen to read, is Grief, the Silent Pandemic. You Are Not Alone became an Amazon #1 bestseller in North America and UK and received a bronze medal in the Global Book Awards. But credentials only tell us part of somebody's story, and today I'm much more interested in the person underneath them. Doug has written openly about looking at his own health experiences, recognizing PTSD within his own story, and reflecting on how his struggles affected not only himself, but also his wife and his children. And then grief became profoundly personal. Unfortunately, Doug lost his beloved wife. Suddenly, grief wasn't something happened in somebody else's life. Doug was living it. The absence, the memories, the empty space, the questions. And from that deeply personal experience, alongside his years of supporting others, came Grief, the Silent Pandemic. But today, I don't simply want to speak to Doug the author. I don't simply want to speak to Doug the mentor. I want to meet Doug. I want to meet the husband, the father, the person who loved, Doug the person who lost, and ultimately Doug the human being who has had to discover what life looks like afterwards. So Doug, thank you so much for joining me on the Green Room podcast today. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity because as we were talking before your show started was that appearing on podcasts, yours as a good example, is very therapeutic for me. It helps me in my healing journey. Does it get me to where I would like to be? It's baby steps, I guess. So, it's the I have to watch her because I'm I'm a very emotional male, and I sometimes get emotional, and listening to you do the intro, you hit a few spots that I went, "Oh, this is going to be a tough road to hoe, but we'll give it our best shot."
Sure. And as we discussed earlier, Doug, again, I'm quite an open male with my emotions, and we've had very similar kind of, let's say, twists and turns within our life. And I think that's why I discussed you earlier. I thought, all my previous guests have been so wonderful and such moving people. And I think with yourself, they've all had to make such, amazing steps forward to be able to get through this, through their challenges they had. And in regards to that, as I was saying earlier, I think it can be hard for me sometimes when I have male therapists who are there with their emotions. So we get through it together one way or another, even if we've got to take a deep breath. Because if I see anybody, my guests or my clients showing emotions, I think I have the battle in between being the therapist and being the human. And so, we'll have a dance around any of our emotions as we go along, Doug, if you're okay with that.
Just fine with that. The big thing for me is that while I'm experiencing those emotions, I'm also trying to help others. And I think, for you and I, that's a thing we share. And it's challenging at best to be able to, because you want to help others, but at the same time, you need to recognize the fact that there's also one important person that needs to have help, and that's ourselves. We don't take the time that we should be taking in order to deal with grief. And you had mentioned post traumatic stress. I have a sense or a feeling that I'm further along dealing with that than I am with the grief. And Deborah passed away in 2021. Every day is a challenge.
Sure, I can only imagine with that, Doug. And thank you so much for giving us that insight. And I mean, yeah, it's even now. I always do this when I have guests, amazing like yourselves, where they plant stuff on this meeting, and my mind starts ticking around. I've got so many questions. So, I mean, before we kind of talk about your books and before we talk about the grief, before mentoring, loss or any of those, life hurdles we have in front of us, I want to start with probably one of the simplest questions one human being can ask another. And I've changed this, especially as well with you being my client, my guest on my show. I've looked at my previous write ups and I'm like, God, it just sounds so kind of like introduction, get them in, out, thank you. So I've changed this a little bit now, and I've really gave this thought. I was up early hours this morning going over my ideas, and kind of like I want to kind of probably start one of the simplest questions really one human being can ask another, and but strangely, it's also one we often forget to ask properly. Is most importantly, how are you?
And that's a tough one to answer because my definition of how I am is going to be different than your definition of how I am. So how am I? If you truly want to know how I am, think of an individual standing by the lake shore and afraid to take a step because I don't know how deep the pool is. And I'm afraid to do much of anything as far as moving forward until I can figure out, can I take that step across the pool of water? And a lot of times for me, like right now, for me, the most important thing is that I I want to make sure that we're honoring Deborah's life, and because she was a very integral part of mine, so I want to make sure that that I do that justice, if you want to use that term. But for the most part, it's being able to recognize that I still have things I need to do as far as our relationship is concerned. And that's a tough thing to have to do.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm kind of what an interesting. I always kind of visualize when people tell me where they are, at the edge of the lake, and just visualizing you getting ready to take the next step, whichever that is. So thank you for giving me some insight there, Doug. I kind of drift off with some visualizations every so often, and so again, obviously, massive transformation, and we'll do the best we can to kind of have this show so we can, recognise that we're getting to the stage of where Deborah was, and we will explore that as we go along. And I'll do my utmost best to help people become aware in regards to loss and grief, especially with your story, to be able to hopefully give some of the other dogs out there who possibly are not as strong or not as resilient as what you've been, to be able to sit and turn and face this. And hence, that's the purpose of this podcast, is to help that one person if, they're in certain circumstances of thinking, hang on a minute, I can relate to this, and give them some form of hope. So kind of when you take away the books and the titles and the professional roles and achievements you've, massively achieved over the years, who is Doug, beneath all that? Who is Doug as a person?
That's a good question, and I can kind of give the 35,000-foot glimpse of here's Doug, but I'm a farm boy. I grew up on a farm, and then I went and I joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and I that's where I met Deborah. I ended up being transferred or stationed, whichever term you want to use, in a small community where her aunt and uncle lived at the same. And so that's how I got to meet Deborah. And eventually she, she, she was what I always coined the phrase, she was my photo album bride, because her aunt and uncle hauled out a photo album one night that we were just sitting talking, and they said, these are some of our family. And they showed me a picture of Deborah. And I said, well, who is that? And they said, well, that's our niece. And I said, get her up here. And so they arranged for her to move to the community that I was stationed in. And that was kind of the start as my photo album bride. That was the start of our journey together as eventually husband and wife. And and we just continued on that way. And so she participated, some of the traumatic events as a police officer's wife. She got to experience some of the traumatic events and stuff, and she was my support structure. you know s- but as taking us back to your original question, I was in the police force for 25 years and had post-traumatic stress, and then retired from the police force and went into some leadership and management positions. And it was probably about late 1900s that I formed a company called Talent C, and it was focused on all things mentoring, including mentor certification and all those sort of things. And and I've just continued to move forward with that, with a lot more emphasis on the grief mentor idea. I've been doing quite a bit of work on that part. So yeah, that was a long-winded answer, but
No, not at all. That's brilliant. That's given us so much in depth for who Doug was as a person, and I love that you've done the transformation. I mean, 25 years on the police force, and I can only imagine what you got to see throughout your time, and then making that transformation to mentoring people. I mean, that's definitely something I want to pick your brain about is mentoring. I think that might give me some confidence. But that's another conversation. I'd speak to you hours about that. You probably see that through me already, Doug, with your experience. So thank you so much for giving me that, and especially how you met Deborah. And I loved obviously the ideal photograph. The ideal photograph would just so it gave me so much visions again of what you saw and saying, get her here. I can I went off with that story because I do remember in your podcast you like doing the storytelling side of things. So I'm quite sure if you see me drifting off every so often, you're taking me into that story journey. So do bear with me. So if I asked, who is Doug Lauren, just say, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, well, what would the answer have been different?
It would have been if you can, because at that particular stage in my life, Deborah was a big part of it. Everywhere we went together. And, it was, she was a very passionate person. She had more love to give than I've ever seen in anyone else. And, she made sure that what we shared was filled with love and, compassion. Compassion for us as a couple, but more just as important, compassion for others. Her friends, she had a huge friend circle. So, and she always used to say, those are her friends, not mine. So, it was kind of funny that way. But as far, I'm just, when I think of where was I 25 years ago, I was standing on the edge of that lake, and I was searching because I had this sense or this feeling that there was going to be a change, and I needed to be prepared for it, which I think I could have done a better job, but you know, I was cognizant or aware of change was coming, and I needed to prepare for that.
You. And again, that's given me I find that fascinating with the prepare yourself. Again, I'm not sure I didn't have a chance to discuss with you, but many years back, I had my stepfather who had motor neuron disease. I'm really interesting through those times, as we know that the reality truth is there's nothing we can really do. And I always remember the dynamics of my family, like with my mum and my sister, and how they were really battling with having that acceptance of what the diagnosis for. And with myself, I was coming towards the end of my counselling training, and you are taught to sit with some of your, kind of darkest moments, and you're forced to write essays around them. And I was more acceptant to the diagnosis. But yeah, just having a look at how you kind of pulled me into that kind of prepping, that's really interesting. I can really relate to you there of kind of having that preparation for whatever comes next. So and having that feeling as well what you spoke about. I can really sorry about this, Doug. I'd speak to you for hours. I can really relate to what you're saying there. And thank you so much for giving me some insight. And kind of this is kind of like a double throw out question, really. You know, do you think obviously, we do you think loss forced you to meet yourself differently? Because again, we don't really go through this until it starts happening to us. And do you feel that kind of puts you in a position of discovering things about yourself which you would have never thought to ever explored until this happened?
Definitely. Yeah, it changes everything. The how you look at different things. How you look at grocery shopping as an example, going to buy groceries. Now you're buying for one instead of two. And, so there's an adjustment that has to take place there, understanding that it's okay to cry in the grocery store when your emotions do a switch on you and they ramp up and you don't have time to actually figure out how am I going to deal if something strange by definition, if something like that happens, how do I manage that? And just to think that, it kind of happened for a reason, but I'm still trying to figure out what that reason is. Excuse me. The one thing that always the picture that sticks in my mind the most is sitting in the emergency room at the hospital, and we'd been told that Deborah needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible and stuff, and we're sitting in the hospital, and 3 words: Deborah has cancer. That's all it took to change our whole existence was Deborah had Deborah has cancer. And I reflect on that periodically where I go, what needed to happen? How do I go about changing that outcome? And there is no way that I can change the outcome. It it happened because it had to happen, or it happened because it happened.
Okay, I knew this was going to be such a moving episode. Again, I don't know what it is with your storytelling. I've got to kind of have a look at some more of your podcast because your voice really projects that visualization for me. So thank you for that. And kind of like what you said there, that change, that realization that things are going to change, and that again, I hear a lot of kind of acceptance, having to kind of accept that the best you can, being told those 3 words. I mean, to digest it and reflect all in one, as you know, can be really overwhelming. And sometimes life don't, necessarily give us a choice about change. The question becomes, what do we do with a person who emerges afterwards? So really, I find it so powerful. I love, counseling and psychotherapy and how we as humans, use our mind in regards to yourself, because obviously you had some element of awareness around you, and kind of having that kind of whole reality hitting you out of nowhere to say, life's going to change. So I really, really appreciate giving that insight. You're definitely one of those guests who gets me thinking so much, Doug. So again, if I waffle on a little bit there, do bear with me because I'm just digesting everything at the same time. I mean, there's something I noticed looking across your books as well. So you've written about mentoring, you've written about mental health and not struggling entirely alone, and now you've written about grief. On the surface, they're kind of different subjects, if you like, but underneath, I keep seeing one word: is that connection. And I kind of that keeps coming out for me here. I don't know why I've even written it down on my notes. Great big capitals connection there. And I mean, when you kind of look at the gift of mentoring, you're not alone. And then now we're on to like grief, the silent pandemic. Do you think human connection was actually the subject, if you like, you were writing about all along?
That's a great observation because I would suggest that it's connection, but it's also a relationship. So it's a combination of the two, that in order to be able to have those connections, you need to have relationships. And those relationships come in the form of love, and predominantly they come in the form of love and caring. I need to have that sense of caring as a giver and a receiver, of that those emotions in order for me to, number 1, help myself, but more importantly, to be able to take what I'm feeling and share that with others so that they can d get get back on track with their healing journey, or they can just begin to have a healing journey.
Sure. That's kind of hell of a weight to hold, isn't it? In regards to, again, with my therapy work, I work within the NHS, working with people with personality disorders, and in the evenings I do my counselling, and then life stuff happens, and again, because I have regular counselling supervision once a month, I do see a therapist myself every so often, and it's really interesting sometimes that it's trying to get balance between all that at once, which sometimes we don't, and I always have that kind of battle in me, and trying to be more resilient than most, and I'm trying to be the counselor one minute and I'm being the human. So trying to bounce around all these, and as we all know about self-care, putting one's needs first, I always tell it to everybody, especially professionals as well, like yourself, that you know do we always do that all the time? I could probably answer for many of us, not really, but at the same time, just trying to get your balance through that, triggering anything within yourself, making sure that the people you're mentoring are safe. So trying to get that fine balance. I'm kind of visualizing you bouncing around this, but then growing at the same time. Thanks for kind of giving me that. And what really struck me is, the different books, different stages of life, but perhaps the underlying question here is what changes when another human being generally walks beside us, especially when we're in that stage.
If good things will happen with them walking beside us, but I'm a firm believer that if you want to bring value to a relationship with me, you have to have walked in those shoes yourself, because you you won't know what to say, when to say it, or how to say it. And so you'll give it your best shot, but sometimes the best shot may end up doing more harm than good. And so, it's like people say, I don't know what to say, and I've always said, then that's what you have to say. I don't know what to say. Help me help you on your journey, and let me let me help you. Let me hold your hand while we go for this walk. It's I go to 2 or 3 support groups now, and you would think that I would be going to get help for or to help others, but I'm actually getting help for myself by going to these support groups. And there's some are grief, some are mental health support groups. They're all sort of different. Each has its own purpose, but we need to leverage whatever tools that are out there for us. And it just, for me, these support groups, because one, I'm a participant, and in another one I'm actually a co-facilitator. So and the big thing is that that you want to be able to participate, because for me, that's the healing part of those groups. And that's the important part of our journey.
Yes, God, I'm smiling here because you're on one hell of a journey, and especially it just shows your professionalism there. Working with the right people. Any new clients I have, I always say to my clients, look, this is about you and your needs, not the not the ego of the therapist. And it has to be the right fit, if you like, sitting with somebody, making sure that you have got that level, or whether it's expertise, life experience I've had, especially when it comes to males. And guys, as I'm sure you know of it within some of your groups, guys are very blunt and open, and they want to know some lived experience. They want to know that you've been through possibly some of this, because they can be quite guarded in therapy. I know some of my recent clients recently, some guys come in really guarded because they have gone around different services, and unfortunately people haven't kind of met them with compassion or on their level. So it's really interesting. One, we have to be careful who we work with, not, not only to, do anything for themselves, but we have to really watch ourselves as human beings as well. We have triggers, we have feelings, and it sounds like you're really watching your boundaries, but on such a amazing self-discovery of, where this journey is going for you, currently. It's you give me so much insight, Doug. I could ask you so many questions. We'll be here for 24 hours if I carried on.
That's not a bad thing.
And you kind of your earlier work, the gift of mentoring, because I mean you've done all this, and mentoring I find fascinating. Especially people like yourself who've got this lived experience, and going from the police officer to like the mentor, the guy who writes the books, and going on such a very inspiring, deep journey himself. I mean, again, obviously you earlier work, the gift of mentoring describes mentoring as a lifelong journey and learning and development, if you like. So why call mentoring a gift?
Because it is. It's I wouldn't be on the journey I'm on if it weren't for mentoring. And I wouldn't be able to deal with the loss of Deborah as as well as I have. Is it perfect? No, but it's the mentoring segment or the mentoring part of my life by being involved in that part of it has made some days that are normally very challenging, it's made them just a little bit easier. It's like standing on the edge of that big lake is that I could jump in and may not be able to swim, but I've got mentoring that's there as that support structure, and and it's going to help me deal with what I'm thinking and what I'm wanting to do. It some days it can be as much as what prevents you from maybe contemplating suicide. It's just that little thing called mentoring that actually can bring that to your relationship.
Well, that's really interesting as well, because I'm noticing, there is kind of debates between all sorts of professional areas, should I say. So we've got coaches, mentors, we've got therapists, we've got counselors, we've got psychotherapists. The list goes on. And there's good and bad and all. That's what I always say to people. I'm very open-minded with different ideas and theories. I find it fascinating. Again, I'm on this journey as yourself. I'm meeting wonderful people like yourself, my clients, my work. I'm not saying there's different times where, like you and I, there's times I need to have my downtime. Yesterday, for instance, I had no clients. I had a clear day because I'm working long weeks, and as nice as it was, Doug, I was kind of rattling around a little bit because I'm normally used to prepping and thinking, okay, I've got this client. So it kind of makes you aware of how important, our own self-care within, helping within this sector. So again, I really had some downtime and I'd done nothing. But for myself, I'm sure you'll notice this with doing all your groups and mentoring and your work you do. When you go out of that routine for a little while, it really threw me off a little bit yesterday because I thought, I haven't got to do anything bar for myself, which was actually quite nice because I was more acceptant to it. So it's quite interesting that that's happened there as well. So, I mean, what you mentioned about the gift side of things, and I find it really moving in what you said earlier. I mean, what can one human being give another through a mentoring relationship that information and advice alone can't provide?
You know, you take a look at the definition of mentoring, and it's one that's focused on a continuous learning and development, but it's mentoring is a two-way trusted relationship where both the mentor and mentee learn and grow together on a personal and professional basis. So the gift that I'm going to bring to the table is the realization that mentoring is not only career development, but it's also there is a personal side to mentoring, being able to help somebody. A good example was I ended up being referred to a young lady who was struggling to find employment, and I ended up meeting with her only to be able to sort of go, okay, I think I know what the root cause is. And she was somebody who was struggling with self-esteem, self-confidence, self-worth, all of the, as I called them, all the selves. And so we spent some time together, and as we got more and more engaged in the relationship and the mentoring relationship. She she became stronger. She became better. She we're here in Regina, Saskatchewan, and this doesn't have much bearing probably for a lot of people, but she ended up moving to getting a job in Toronto in the corporate office only because she ended up becoming somebody who was now who believed in themselves. I used the old adage of what I want you to do is when you get up in the morning is, take a post-it note and stick it to the bathroom mirror. And on that post-it note, it's going to say, I am a good person. I can do great things. And by doing that, you're going to be able to realize that, yes, you are a good person, and that, yes, you're going to be able to make those changes that you want to make, and that I know that you're capable of doing. And so going forward that way.
Again, I've got so many things where, thank you for sharing that, and obviously being with that person on that journey. That's what I say to a lot of my clients is, okay, I'm a qualified counselor. I'm not going to give everybody their own answers because it's all about how we find them together, and being on that windy road as you can be with your mentoring, like I can with my counseling, and it's such a tough but wonderful and very inspiring journey that somebody's felt comfortable to share their experience with you, and I find that really, really powerful. And again, it's like what you've done there with all the mentoring side of things. I hear all this wonderful stuff and I hear it and it pops up like a light bulb with me, Doug. And I'm like, yeah, I'll do that another time. And the weird thing is, I've actually wrote that down, what you've done now, and I'm actually going to try it. So I feel like there's part mentoring ideas. I feel like you're planting a seed here, which I'm massively grateful of. So I'm going to see how that gets on for a little while because I hear a lot of that, but I don't do any of it. So I'd be a hypocrite if I said, yeah, I do it every day, Doug, and I'm perfect at it, because I don't. But I mean, I'm gonna start using that because there's kind of like, I'm not sure about yourself, this journey which we're on for whatever reasons. When these sort of things pop up, it's kind of like I want to add them to my routine. I want to add them to my structure to see how it works. I've tried certain ways, and okay, they're not quite really working how I want to, but let's have a little bit of a twist on this to see what we can do there. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And again, we got, can someone know all the theory, have the qualifications, and still be a poor listener?
Can you repeat that? That's
And so can somebody kind of like know? We spoke about obviously counseling, psychotherapy, mentoring, coaching, etc. Can somebody know all the theory and have the qualifications and still be a poor listener? And what separates advice giving from generally walking alongside somebody?
you know the the part that I typically struggle with is the aspect of the difference between the academic approach and the practical approach.
Hmm.
And I'm very much a person who promotes the practical approach. So, in all the things I've done, any certifications or anything like that that I have have obtained, I've done so with the idea in mind of taking my lived experience and putting that into practice. There is a place for the academic, and because we, as being a mentor who is on a continuous learning journey, I need to be able to draw on research and of best practices and all of
Yeah.
those things, you know, just like like you've been doing with your career is, we have to figure a way out that we're able to draw all that knowledge out and figure out, okay, how do I shuffle the deck to put that into
Hmm.
a practical
Hmm. Hmm.
application.
Sure.
And by doing so, because what I find with a lot of people that I'm working with to help them on their journey, if I try and shovel them off into an academic journey, they shut down and they don't want to be a part of it because that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I want to learn what you know, or I want to that's not gonna help me grow, that's not gonna be of value to me, and you can try and tell the story that you need a bit of both, but sometimes they only wanna listen to the practical application.
Sure. Sure. I can really relate to that as well, which is, it's really relevant really with the therapy practice. And again, with my training, don't get me wrong, I'd be lying if I didn't. I did struggle with the academic side of things. Eventually, it did sink in, if you like. But I think now, because of nearly 10 years as a practicing counselor, I would say I'm kind of changed into more solution focused, and I'm kind of more behaviorist. So I'm kind of, how's the person responding? I don't really look so much into the diagnosis they've had because I'm like, look, I'm not clinical. So I'm not sure if that's just my way of kind of looking out for myself as a professional, because again, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but again, it's knowing your limits and those boundaries. And what I like about you is that you're so aware of them, and I hear that so much. I've got to kind of tread carefully because of particular places I've worked at. Well, I've had so many people, professionals as well, in particular establishments, doing kind of surveys and, how can we draw people more, in, how can we make them feel more welcome? And I'm sure you and I will be aware of this. And what frustrates me, Doug, is like, we'll start meeting them with compassion, because I hear so many stories where, I can hold my hands up if you're happy with me. Self disclosure here. Back in 2010, I had an attempted suicide in my life, and it took me a hell of a lot of courage to be able to reach out and seek help. And back then, help was the kind of there, but not as much widespread, especially with social media and the broadband. It's more out there than what it was in my time. And I always remember going to a particular doctor, and I went in there and explained to him, I was sat in the railway lines, I was waiting for a train to hit me. I did get off in time, but I was so angry with myself that I didn't do it because I lost friends. They all passed on. So why didn't I have the courage to do the same? And then after then, I went into more of a depressive state where traveling the world, socializing a lot, to, having panic attacks, just walking to the shop. So I didn't really understand what was going on at that time. And I thought, no, I genuinely need help. And mind you, a guy who had a 15-year cocaine addiction, I thought I was invincible until I stopped all that and had to really sit with my emotions and feelings. And I can tell you now, which I'm sure you'll relate, was frightening, was scary. I wanted to avoid like the plague, but I just knew I had to sit with this. And when I reached out to this particular doctor and I told them what I'd done, I mean, they actually sniggered and kind of looked at me, kind of chuckling, if you like. And I was so cross. Where years back, I'm not going to lie, Doug, I'd have probably kicked off in the surgery because of how I was as that person, but I didn't. I said, I can't believe you found my story funny. And I was really quite knocked back by it and felt quite hurt that nobody heard me. But I did eventually go out and get some support myself. I went and got some therapy myself through a local charity, and that kind of put me on to where I am today as not only a male, but as a counsellor. So it's really hard when we get to that stage to reach out, and like what you say, people have to be able to sit with you and kind of feel comfortable that you've got some of that experience. There's good and bad in all sectors, 100%. But at the same time, I've had so many people tell me in the past that you don't come across too clinical. You're not ticking boxes. And I know it does happen. I mean, some of these therapists I've worked with are amazing at what they do, but they're trained in a different way. So I always say to them, at the end of the day, it's the connection you have with that individual. And it's about the client at the end of the day. It's about you and your needs, not my ego. And I always say that to my clients. So it's really interesting you have that within the mentoring side. And again, your professionalism, your boundaries are just so at the top here, Doug. Absolutely mind blowing to hear. So I mean, you've kind of have spent years mentoring others, but what have the people you've mentored taught you? Has being trusted with other people's stories changed you in any way?
What they've done for me or what they've taught me is, it's been respect for that perpetual growth of looking at things from different aspects. So just I had this thought that when I talk about mentoring and what it can do for us, you and I both seem to appear to have similar paths. So our goal in life is, to make the world a better place to be. And that can be, one person, one city, one town, just even if it's baby steps, but it's the fact that we need to be able to do that. And it's the understanding that, it's our goal, our dream in life is to do that, to make, from a healing perspective, to be able to heal others. I I was mentoring at one time point, I was mentoring a young lady who was a hypnotherapist. And we did a past life regression hypnosis where I found out in 3 or 4 different parts of my life, I was I was a healer. And it came through in that hypnotherapy. It came through that because she asked me, she said, "Tell me, what is it that you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a healer." And she went, "Okay." And then we talked some more. Then I got in the rowboat that was supposed to be my life
Mm.
and rowed down the river. And she asked me the questions again, and it was, well, I'm a healer. And I actually got to experience in one of the small towns that we visited through hypnotherapy, I got to experience a young lad who came up to me as I was walking through the downtown area. This young lad came up to me and looked up at me, and I could see pain and suffering and agony in his eyes. And I reached out with my hand and put my hand on top of his head, and all of that disappeared. It was gone. And I went, that just helped cement the fact that I need to continue doing what I'm doing because it's a it's a it's so important that we do that.
Just alone, that's kind of leading me on to the next part of things. And again, I'm so lucky not only speaking to yourself and your story and all the other wonderful people I've met. Even myself, I went before I went down my counseling training. I went down the Reiki healing route and exploring like being the healer. And I haven't done the past aggression. It's one of those things, honest truth, Doug, I've got to do. I hear so many parts of it. I normally dive into more of kind of like helping the people with the psychology aspects of things, where I want to do all the other wonderful things with the past aggression. But again, there's going to be plenty of things I'm going to have lined up for my list of exploration to do. And hypnotherapy, I did nearly train in it when I first when I was coming up to my diploma, but I didn't. I managed to fast track through because of my previous qualifications, and I kind of kicked myself I didn't go down the hypnotherapy route. So I went down the spiritual and Reiki route, and I what an amazing thing for you to be able to do. Again, you have this amazing way of getting my visual aspects coming up, of reaching out to that guy who you felt was in pain and going back into your past life regression and recognizing being the healer. And I done a podcast not so long back and a talk about the wounded healer. And it's so interesting the amount of people I know who work in this helping sector, especially the true compassionate helpers out there in all different aspects. They've been through so much heartbreak and pain where you hear some of their stories and you're like, God, how are you still going? How do you? And I get a few people ask me that, and we all have our different, weird and wonderful ways of how we cope, and I just find it really fascinating that you reached out to that guy and just that one small thing has made such a change for that person's life. And it can be that simple. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. And whatever the guy was going through, just having somebody like yourself to reach out and just say, I've got you, can make such a big difference in somebody's life in such a big way. And I love it that you've got that awareness. I love it that you're the helper and a massively aware helper, obviously. And I just find that really moving of that guy. That's really stuck with me. That one guy is probably in such a tough, desperate times as I'm sure many of us can be. And you was that glimmer of hope for that person. I really do find that really moving, Doug. I really do. That's kind of knocked me back a little bit there that, you reaching out to that one person has really helped them, hopefully projected them onto a different path and hopefully a little bit less bumpy, if you like. I just find that amazing. And again, obviously, why some of us become the helpers. That's moving on to the next questions here for you. Where do you think the helper Doug come from, and what made being there for another person so important to you?
I think that's what Deborah would have wanted. And so because of that, I continue to do what I do. Do have any feelings or anything like that? Of course I do, because that's part of who I am as a person. That's one or two of the things that I need to be doing all the time, but what it, the most important thing is that's what Deborah would have wanted. It's it's her story as much as it is mine.
Yeah, that's as you did say it could be quite a moving podcast, and it's really moving with what you're saying in and bringing Deborah in there of what she wants. I just find that kind of legacy after her passing is such a powerful thing, and I can really feel that with you what you do in there, and I just find that so amazing and really powerful to some sense there, which is really lovely to hear. And I mean, again, you come across as that guy just like the short time we spent to each other. I feel like I could tell you my whole world and there'd probably be emotion and feelings. You're that sort of guy where you'll be ideal to be able to sit down with somebody in tough times. And I can really relate to that with you, where it's quite moving. It's quite, for me, I think it's a little bit kind of moving for me now. God, they're starting, is because there is so few people like that out for me to be on the other side of the pond to hear that. As you know, the roles we do are easy. I mean, it isn't a walk in the park, is it? Let's be honest. And here we go. And for me, it's more, this is more my emotions showing that how inspiring it is to hear you say that, hear what you're doing for these people. And obviously, just myself, I genuinely feel like I could pour my whole heart out to you, and it's having that whole relationship. And this is really rare for me, by the way, because I don't, it's, you got to have that connection. And just alone, I'm not here to do my analysis or anything, but I'm just hearing your story, how you are, how you come across. I'm like, oh my God, if this guy was running a group locally and I'm not one, I've got to make the time, I've got to correct that, I have got to make the time to do things like that. But just alone hearing about your mentoring, I thought, God, if you was running one here locally, I'd be like, I'd love to know more what this guy says. So I'm really, really enjoying this. So thank you. You just given me so much food for thought. And just hearing that from me there, were you always, because I mean, you was a police officer, I mean, you're doing the mentoring, even going back to even your police time, again, I can only imagine how difficult that job was. Were you always somebody people could open up to you? And what do you feel that they kind of sensed in you, if you like?
I What would typically happen is I would have staff working with me, and at the end of the day, because there's all this stuff going on at the end of the day, or even when something kind of was pressing that they felt they needed advice or guidance on, they would always come to my office and say, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with this. And I'd always say, sure you do. No, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to respond. I don't know how to deal with this. You need to fix it. You need to help me. And so I would ask a series of questions that would guide them to the answer that they were searching for. And then what would happen is I would do that and they'd go, oh, I said, see, you knew the answer all along. And they'd say, I don't know what it is, but I come into your office and in a very short time period, whatever it is, I leave here with the answer. And you, all you did was you just asked me a few questions. And I went, yep, that's right. And so started that whole thing of, from a leadership perspective, it was asking questions to guide people, not telling them what to do, but giving them the tools they need for
Hmm.
them, or
Yeah.
for them to be able to work through it. And it was so moving for me, because they were now realizing the power of mentoring and what it is that, how far they could actually go on that journey as a leader or leader slash mentor. And, and that realization helped so many people change their approach to different things. Ended up with a big contingent of leaders that worked with me, and we all shared the same philosophy. And I could always turn around and say to them, now I want you to think about this for a minute before you answer. What what would happen if we were to do this, A, B, or C, or D? And they'd go, okay. And they'd say, well, I think B. And I said, okay, that's good. That's a good response. What happens when you put B into practice? Now I see. And so it was, that sort of approach.
That's really interesting with like some of the tools and techniques I use within my counseling practice is very similar that we can kind of break some of this down and, asking clients the right questions, if you like. And they do, they tend to find it for themselves and being able to break that down because I'm sure you know yourself, I'm sure we've both been there where we've had all this stuff going in our mind and we're trying to figure it out all at once. And what do? We get confused, we're foggy, we try to have all the answers at once. But I think within time, we learn to kind of step back and think, okay, how can we break this down? How can we simplify this a little more so we can find our answers? So I was really interested. I do that, especially because my private practice is more dominated males currently, which I find a massive transition and very interesting. But again, I normally find a lot of guys, I'm not saying females don't do this too, but coming in and they've got all these wonderful ideas and kind of plans they want to do, but they got them all together and they're so confused with all of them. And similar to yourself, it's like breaking them down and kind of helping them be a little bit more digestible for them than trying to figure it out all at once. So I really find out that you've really simplified them, give them like more shorter answers and possibilities instead of it understand it all at once. So I can imagine that, with your new experience of doing that with the people coming in to see you. And I mean, just alone with your police officer work, you've got your own stuff and people coming to you for that. I think I've answered my own question that, do you find that people come to you? And I've been drawn to you straight away. So again, it's obviously having that and having that transition thing. Oh my God, what a powerful thing I can do to be able to hopefully help people find their own answers they seek. And sometimes people, don't remember what kind of support or ideas we give them, but they can remember, that was somewhere I could finally tell the truth. And I found that my really big shift in my life, share opening with my emotions and feelings. And as you know, many of us guys can suppress them. We can lock them away. We can joke about them because we can be so insecure about our own thoughts and feelings, where you and I have learned to discover to be more open with that. I can tell you now there's been therapy sessions, there's been some of my counseling supervisor sessions I have with my supervisor Sarah, where I release emotions. I'm human like anybody else, but I'm not as guarded as what I used to be. And I normally do say to people, just think of it as kind of like releasing that pressure valve. You've got nothing to prove to anybody, but if we carry this around, whether it's anger, frustration, which is our kind of normal response, as you know, something's going to give one way or another. We can jump into that escapism side where we all know we can travel to the moon and back, and those problems are still going to be there. So you really learned to kind of help these people sit with that and said, right, these are your options. Which one are you going to take? So I find that really, really fascinating. It's very similar to what I do within my work. I really find that fascinating. And I mean, your description of "You Are Not Alone." Do bear with me. I've wrote some certain notes to this because there's so much to cram in. So your description of "You Are Not Alone" says it grew from seeing a gap between academic discussions about mentoring, mental health, and practical experiences of using mentoring as part of a support structure. But writing that book for you, became deeply personal, and you said it kind of gave you an opportunity to confront some of your own demons and kind of obviously recognize the big one, PTSD, as well within your own story. When you began writing You Are Not Alone, did you know it was going to become, that personal, or did you start writing one book and discover, kind of like another story underneath that?
I think that the gift of mentoring was a book that it was kind of mentoring 101, where I wanted to give people the mentorship tools, and then we would see where the relationship would go, and then take a step forward to you were not alone. There was no support structure in place because at that particular time point I was drawing on some of my lived experience from working in a law enforcement position in a small community where if there was something traumatic that happened, you just had to deal with it. Or as I used to say, suck it up, buttercup, and get going, because my support structure was a bottle of Scotch whiskey. So when I was having difficulty as a result of a traumatic event, I would turn to that. I'd take the cap off and throw it in the garbage, and I would drink until it was gone. thinking that, oh, this is great. Now, I've just fixed the world's problems, only to realize I've just made them worse.
It's like we spoke about support, wasn't it, earlier of the lack of support, and I've heard it recently again. I've got to kind of tread where I can say things, but there was a police officer I've worked with over the years in the past, and he was telling me even now to this day some of the horrific things they've had to see, and I did question. I know at one point they did have particular therapists or specialists they could speak to, and when I asked him about that, he was like, "No," and I was like, but how do you debrief? How do you? And he spoke to one of his people in charge, who was an old school police officer, um, and he generally said, well done, lad, you've done really well, you saved a life. Right, we've got some more calls to do. And when I heard that and hearing what you're saying there, for you thought the answer would be at the bottom of that bottle, and many people do go down that route. And what I find really interesting is that that was your way, how you got through it in your own way. But then recognizing within time, as we do, it's learning to work with that. But that's so hard, even you with a older generation police officer, and what I've heard to this day now, I can only imagine some of the things, even with my career of homelessness and addictions, I have seen some terrible things, but the police force just takes that to a different scale. And you had to kind of hold that in and try and figure out what can I do with all this stuff. And like you said, flicking the cap in the garbage, and there we go. I'm gonna kind of fix all my problems now once I finish that bottle. And you found a really really powerful ending in regards to saying, we all know we certainly don't find at the end of that bottle, and it's hard to get ourselves back on track from there. So you you described again. You've given me so much thought just in general. You're one of very few have made me so speechless, Doug. So there's just so many questions I've got going around in my head at the moment. And you obviously described about confronting your demons. When we go through life, it's really hard to be able to sit within our own shadow, if you like. And obviously you had to, you described confronting your own demons. What did you what did you discover about Doug that you weren't prepared to find, or prepared to find?
I think what stood out the most for me was that if I didn't change, and this is a combination of different time periods, but for the most part, I went to speak at an event, a day-long workshop, and Deborah came with me as she sometimes would on long road trips. And one of the participants turned to her and said, "And where are you in all of this stuff that he keeps talking about?" Because I had just started at that particular time point, I had just started to speak on the topic of mental health and the impact that it had. And so I was giving my spiel on mental health and, how it can impact, participants and stuff like that. And they asked her, and her response was simply very matter of fact that had he have not changed his behavior, he would have lost me and he would have lost his two children, because we do not need to be subjected to that sort of behavior. And I went, I paused for a moment and then I said, that's a telltale story that, we could spend hours exploring, but suffice it to say that that was a real realization now that I have to deal with as a mentor, that somebody who I'm very close, or who I think I'm close with, has just told me that I needed to get my stuff in order. Otherwise, there would be changes coming that I may not like.
Yeah, that's definitely highlighted some for you in that moment, Doug. I could imagine that kind of. what was going on with you with processing that as well at the same time. I mean, and obviously changing and growing and finding your own way to respond to be different to things. And then obviously your wife massively highlighted that for you as if say, well, yeah, pretty much, if he didn't pull his socks up and got himself in check, well, we'd be gone. I mean, wow, just yeah, just hearing that alone, and that's hell of a lot to intake as well. And that kind of reality check, I could imagine, just say, you know, she's pretty much told me some home truths there, and there's something I have to acknowledge. But yeah, there's such interesting transitions and shifts happening to you throughout your life and your career with that. Growing with your mentorships, having your wife highlight in regards to yes, if you went down that route, we won't be around. So hell of a lot of kind of sitting with your own demons there and having to face them. And as you know, we can have that avoidance. Like I spoke earlier on before the podcast, that my avoidance could be substances or alcohol, and I could go on holiday because I had the money to do it, and kind of think I could find my answers there. But as you know yourself, they follow us wherever we go, and it's learning to sit round and face them. And it sounds like you had the courage and the resilience to be able to sit and face some of this stuff, even though some of it can sit with us a little bit funny because we're humans, we feel things. And having Deborah kind of pretty much give you that, hint as if to say, yeah, if he don't pull his socks up or he doesn't kind of play ball, we're gone. It's that simple. So that was kind of hell of a reality check for you to be able to acknowledge at the same time. I mean,
I was just going to say, but at the same time, it also demonstrated the strength of the relationship that we had. She felt comfortable enough to share that, and knowing that I would be able to weather that storm no matter where we were. And here we are in a room full of, probably 25 or 30 people, and to be told that you either cleaned up your act or you'll be out the door, that she had confidence in me as well, being able to sort of deal with that type of emotion and move forward. And so, we had a pretty good conversation on the way home to be able to say, "Were you serious?" And she went, "Yeah, I'm serious." I said, "Okay, consider it done."
And that just shows alone how powerful the relationship was with you guys of kind of being open and one another, and that's hard. I mean, I've had so many clients to this day where they keep some of this hidden stuff, these big conversations we need to have, but we avoid. But you guys really kind of put, the elephant was in the room was exposed, and excuse me, and what I admire there is that both of you sat with that and faced it together. And it was kind of like pretty much, yeah, I was 100% being honest. And he was like, okay, I'm going to work with you on this. I find that really powerful when couples can do that. It just shows how much, yeah, how much they got one another, how much they had each other's back. So thank you for sharing that with me. I really do appreciate that. And again, it's one of these things when I look at all you guys have written these amazing books, and I've had a couple of hints of people to say, "Oh, have you thought about writing one?" I'm not quite there yet, but I find it inspiring and how brave you guys are to be able to do that. I'm still kind of like what you said about I'm on the edge of the lake at the moment, Doug, and I want to jump in, but I'm still sat there because that's my little safe space. That's something I could possibly speak to you in the near future. And I mean, again, sometimes writing can kind of become like holding up a mirror, I can imagine. And it doesn't necessarily tell us who we are, but it can make it kind of harder, to look away, if you like, because you had to start writing this stuff and you had to sit with those feelings. Very similar to some of my therapy training. Some of the stuff we had to write about did make me feel uncomfortable, but it did build my resilience towards that. It was more digestible, if you like. Having kind of like the word PTSD, which again, comes up in a lot, especially obviously as we know within mental health. Um, so PTSD for part of your experience, was kind of having that kind of diagnosis, that kind of relief for your experience. Was it kind of painful? Was it both? Because again, you have some people, again, I'm not a clinical psychologist, it's not my area. You have some people who have certain traits and behave in certain ways, and they'd like to have the diagnosis to, kind of fill the gaps they haven't quite understood. And then you have other people I've realized are kind of like, yeah, I'm probably aware of those traits, but I'm okay to move on through that. And it's not surprised that most people, especially in the police force, haven't had that form, PTSD happen because obviously the job. So was finally having the word PTSD for part of your experience reliving? So, was it painful? Was it both? I mean, what was going on for you there, Doug?
I you know, I think the biggest thing was the realization that there's a name that I can put around how I feel and how I behave, where before, you know, before I could say PTSD and so what, nobody really understood. Nobody, no, there was none of that. So with the behaviors that I would exhibit and stuff like that, people just thought, okay, you know, he's crazy or, something like that, instead of being able to say, no, he's not. He's dealing with trauma and he's got post traumatic stress disorder, if you want to use that. And we need to be there to support him as he, because we think of it from the little things. We got moved around in the police force. I got my family and I both we got moved around quite a bit. We wouldn't hang pictures on the wall in our house that we'd been given to live in. We wouldn't hang pictures because it seemed that as soon as we hung those pictures, the phone would ring and it would be, pack your bags, you're moving again. And we don't understand the impact that that has on your wife and your children, to have to be constantly in a state of flux. And so, we had to deal with that and not make it something that was traumatic per se, just something, it's a change in routine and we need to kind of deal with it, but
Mm,
deal with it as a family.
sure. Well, again, that gives me insight because I've moved a few times myself, and you highlighting so many things to me. So sincerely grateful. As one of my fears is the whole moving. Is the landlord going to put up sale and that like and it can be a bit of a headache, as we know, the unsettling, not kind of settling yourself or you found powerful, not really hanging up any pictures because what's the point? We'll be moving soon. So yeah, that kind of unsettling side, not only with the job you done, but you had to kind of look out for the family, work together as a family through that as well, plus your changes which were going on and the things you saw and got to kind of grow your mentorship with everyone coming to you with kind of their own problems at the same time. So yeah, in my head, I'm like, God, how did this guy find time to himself? We do somehow, but just alone with that. So, I mean, obviously having kind of that more understanding with PTSD, which I presume kind of helped you kind of understanding more that, something from something that happened to me, from there is something fundamentally wrong to me. Like you said before, people will be like, God, it's really crazy. But at the same time, with diagnosis and gives a confirmation, isn't guy crazy. He can go through tough times. And so I'm really, really glad, especially back in those days and not having that diagnosis or even really speaking about some parts of mental health. It was kind of like, suck it up, buttercup. We have up and down days. Get on with it. That's kind of similar to what I had as a youngster. It's kind of like, I remember my stepdad, don't show your emotions. Women do that. Go, go off and be a man. So when I look back now, giving somebody that sort of advice, I'm like, seriously, wonder why some of us turn out how we are. Um, so yeah, really, really grateful for that insight there. And obviously you also said obviously you relied on a lot heavily on your wife and your children while kind of recognizing they had their own trauma connection with what they experienced around you. So what was it like that people supporting you were also having their own experience of what they were going.
I think what we were doing was we were trying to lessen what they were having to deal with, and I or Deborah or both of us would absorb that as some of the things that we had to deal with. And you still, as much as you try to do that, there will still be times where you needed to have those family discussions as to, how come this is happening, and, why is dad so angry, and, stuff like that. Just those as emotions that I was dealing with that now the family had to deal with or was exposed to. So it was it was the aspect of, as much as we can work together as a family unit, the stronger that we would be.
Sure. Yeah, it's really, I really find it really moving that you guys are going through so many different things and changing at the same time, but then drawing in together with that. And knowing the differences as well of kind of understanding your own behavior and kind of excusing it, if you like. So how did you begin to kind of hold responsibility and kind of self-compassion, if you like, together? I mean, how did you begin kind of holding that?
I think that what obviously as time transpired and moved on, and we got transferred some more times, and we ended up in a place where in a community where there was more stability for Deborah and the two children. And I would still end up, having different functions where I was required to drive to different locations and stuff. We were able to kind of put the nucleus of the family in a sort of in one's place so that they could build the resilience that they needed in order to be able to deal with any of the changes. And we tried to minimize the amount of moving that was taking place or that had been taking place so that it gave us that stability.
Again, there's a lot of coming together as one, which I really like that you kind of support network within, your inner circle, if you like. And I find that really moving that all of you guys really done your best to kind of get through it the best you can. And I mean, during obviously with some of your mental health struggles, did you ever kind of feel alone, even though you weren't physically alone? Because it sounds like you had the supported wife, and kids as well. I mean, did you ever feel alone, even though you weren't kind of physically alone?
There were times though that I was physically alone, and some of it was pre Deborah and the kids, where while we were in the throes of being engaged to get married, and having to deal with Deborah being back at her parents' place preparing for the wedding, me still being stationed in a small northern community, and we used to write letters to each other. We'd write, I don't know what, I've probably got 25 or 30 letters, and kind of joked at the time, but Deborah had laced the letters with perfume. So every time the mail would be delivered to the post office, they'd say, "Oh, another letter's here for you from Deborah." And it was that sort of um, thing. And then, as far as additional time periods, while I was still in the police force, there were times where I got sent off to a training course that was a month in duration, and so I ended up having to deal with the separation that we hadn't had to experience for a period of time. So, there were times where, you'd be exposed to that loneliness and sort of say, okay, now I know why I didn't want to do this any longer.
Yeah, just kind of it just makes me dizzy of you trying to do your job, your family trying to stick together while you've all been shuffling around, and then you're thrown off somewhere else to do some more intense training. Again, I still don't see this kind of gap with time for Doug. It's just I'm trying to draw my own story up here, if you don't mind me saying, and it's kind of like teaming together as a family can be moving 1 minute and shifted to another. Then you're thrown away somewhere else because you got training, or you're literally working in another area while everyone else is just kind of packing up boxes or trying to settle here. Again, it just makes me dizzy just thinking about it, especially with the job you do, having that kind of grounding and that kind of comfort to some aspect. And it wasn't really there for you. You could, be up sticks before you know it. So, I mean, again, it's kind of like when the helper, because obviously with you being the helper or the healer, I mean, when the healer stroke helper needs help, was it difficult for Doug, the helper, to become Doug, the person who needed some help?
I, you know, Good question, but I don't think that I was, because I took it was important for me to be able to do things like we talked earlier. The podcast bring, it's part of the healing process for me. Sitting down and having a conversation with somebody who needs mentoring, that's that's another, thing that helps me deal with, a lot of the that's my support structure, is knowing that I'm helping others by mentoring them, no matter what type of mentoring it is, but that I'm helping them. And that just, kind of that's a deeper, richer mentoring experience that I hope to help people with. And by so doing that, I'm helping myself.
Yeah, again, that's really such a transformation shift. As you grow, they grow, and I find that really moving, and then I really do understand some of that. And there have been, many times in my own kind of professional career, if you like, something I've understood, but emotionally, I've simply been a human being inside of it. Sometimes pain asks us to admit, this hurts. I mean, it's one of those feelings where, unfortunately, there's two things, as I say to people in this life, there's two things we we certainly can't avoid, which is taxes and harsher Ishar is death. So again, it's kind of, you know, did you kind of give yourself permission to simply be Doug rather than the mentor? Because again, there's all this stuff. You had your police role, you was being the dad, you was being the husband, you was being kind of the mentor at that time, but not really knowing it within your job as well. Plus, kind of going through your own battles there. Did you have time to give yourself simply to be you rather than, let's be honest, the person who's saving everybody?
I would say yes, I had time because I made time. And I would tell others that were struggling that, you need to take time for yourself because it's important. And it's one of those things, don't do as I say, do as what, what
Mm,
I meant. So
mm,
I just I found that if I could keep doing what I'm doing, it helps me stay in a better place.
mm.
Like I had one or two mentoring sessions yesterday, I think it was, and I have some more coming up this week. And I, despite everything else that's going on all around, I'm actually looking forward to those conversations.
It's nice when you have that, isn't it? There's
Yeah.
I think I have sometimes with clients, depending where they are, sometimes a deep breath before session, and I think, see what's going to happen. And sometimes they throw me off because we don't explore that sometimes. So they keep us on our toes, but it's really lovely, isn't it? When you can actually, I'm not saying, I love working with all my clients. They're such amazing and inspiring people. But I mean, when you're really looking forward to that work with somebody, similar to the podcast doing with yourself, there's so much information you've done and so much life experience. Again, I'm just kind of so keen to work with that. And I can have that with my clients too. And, I use a little bit of humor where I'm like, I need to get out more, but I wouldn't change my personal journey, as tough as that's been sometimes, and being able to have this amazing position to be able to speak to people like yourself and the clients I have. I am so truly grateful for that. And as you know, it's such an amazing gift to be able to do. You hear a lot of people saying, yes, I'm a great listener. As you know, Doug, there's a big difference of just sitting down, listening to somebody and doing the similar work to what we do. It's reaching on that person at a different level. And I find that you can really do that. Again, it's like I said to you, you're that sort of mentor. I'd really tell you my life story, and it's really interesting that I feel comfortable with that. And again, this is me kind of big one, so I kind of want to tread carefully here. One, because of, again, I don't want to poke in areas I don't want to, and two, I don't want to offend any of my guests in any way. So before we talk about losing your wife, I want people I want people to know a little bit about her life. Who was Deborah? Who was your wife? Ok.
No, she was a woman that had a heart as big as you could ever think of. She, as her mom used to say, that she had this big super heart. She needed lots of love and lots of compassion and caring and all of those things. That was important to her. She, she ended up she worked in a fitness center. Then she went where she ended up bodybuilding, so doing competitive bodybuilding and stuff. But I think, there's all those things. The most important part was she was somebody who took wanted to be able to have relationships with as many people as she possibly could. She worked at a local, one of the main hotels here in Regina, and she had a relationship with every guest that came through the doors of that hotel. It just blew me away. Like, she was able, and she remembered, if they had children, if they had grandchildren, if she remembered all those details that, you would sort of go, yeah, it's not a big deal. Well, it was to them,
Mm.
and she was able to do that. As that was who she was. And like I said at the beginning when we were talking, she always used to say that those are her friends, not mine. So you have to go get your own. And she had a great sense of humor. Uh, and she just loved to be loved.
Thanks for sharing that. I really like hearing you speak about her as a person, and grief conversations don't have to only contain sadness, but they can be warmth and humor and affection. And and again, thank you so much. I want to tread carefully there, as I'm sure you know it. I want to explore so much of you, but at the same time, I don't want to dig things up too much. And I mean, what again, kind of diving in here, but I don't want to kind of uh, trigger anything too much in it. Somebody's life is. So we look at some of these details which matter in this. Somebody's life is so much bigger than the way it ended. And what did she understand about you that perhaps nobody else quite understood? Because you So she sounds an amazing woman in regards to recognizing all the people plus their children, meeting them with compassion, being that people person, which it sounds like she so much was, and remembering everything as well. I mean, what did she understand about you that perhaps nobody else quite understood?
I think that number one, that would be that I'm human like everyone else, and that I too need a lot of love and support, and that's what made us a great. We had a great relationship because we both shared, excuse me, that love and support for each other, and it was important that we did so, and we had the ability to communicate effectively as a couple. It's almost as though I knew what she was thinking and she knew what I was thinking. And sometimes we didn't have to say anything. We just looked at each other and we knew.
Oh, thank you for that, Doug. I know it's kind of, I so want to get into your mind about things, and you're just alone hearing how you guys are. I can only vision what your relationship was like. And would you say that losing her was kind of one of the witnesses of your own life? And kind of last thing on this in regards to what ordinary thing do you miss most?
The ordinary things was all the things, probably just to summarize, all the things we used to do together, we now do, I do separate as a single one person event.
And again, thank you so much for being brave and sharing this with me, Doug. Again, I'm really appreciating this. And again, I don't want to tread over my marking. Please do say if I ever do. Again, kind of going back to that period, and then take your time. There's definitely no rush here. I mean, we explored a bit of that, the three words of Deborah has cancer, one of those real kind of insight moments you had within yourself. Kind of looking back now, what did that version of Doug need most at that time with your awareness you got now? What do you remember about yourself in those first few hours or days? And kind of what did Doug need the most of in that time?
Uh, I think you're referring to the few hours shortly after she passed.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I had started the grieving process fairly early because I had, all the questions that typically you would be asking yourself, like, why me? And, you know, all of those particular questions. My mind was racing through some of that. And now what am I going to do? Because, you know, I don't have Deborah to lean on, or my support was gone, and I needed to figure out how I was going to deal with that.
Thank you for sharing that with me, Doug. It's kind of, again, I don't want to, rush or push past things here as well. And again, it sounds like obviously you recognize between obviously the intellectual side of knowing, Deborah had passed, and emotionally kind of comprehending that she was gone. I mean, what a powerful lot of insight for yourself of recognizing that. And it sounds like with the discussion you said earlier about kind of prepping, I feel that's such a crucial part of some of these stages, especially when people unfortunately went through where Deborah was, and having that prepping and that awareness and becoming more kind of acceptance of what diagnosis you've been given to some aspect of being able to process that. And it sounds like you managed to kind of process that quite well in some way and kind of work through that to where you are today. I mean, thank you for trusting me with that. I don't want to kind of rush past it. And what's it like, if you don't mind me asking, what's it like remembering that now, that time now for you? Because I know it's only a few years on from there. And like I say, tell me if
You
we.
know, I would say that the feelings are still much the same. Yeah, the feelings are still much the same. You try to deal with those, but you can't always deal with them because of the impact they've had on your day-to-day life.
And again, I've got so many questions to ask you, that exploration of where we are in the stages of grief on that side, because we can get, who am I now? The loneliness side of things as well. The person, I want isn't here. And, nobody is here, and kind of losing that future, if you like. And how did you kind of understand that continuing to live didn't kind of mean leaving Deborah behind? I mean, what kind of helped you kind of understand that? Because again, we've had PTSD, we've had a loss of a loved one. We've been with so dearly, and they've been such a huge part of our life. I mean, how did you understand the kind of continuing? Because I know you've mentioned about Deborah and doing her legacy, which I think so heartwarming and just so moving to hear. I mean, how did you understand that continuing to live didn't really mean leaving her behind?
I don't think that I've left her behind at all. I think I've brought her along with me on the journey. I was I went to a writer's retreat that I had set up for myself to kinda help kickstart the book, and I had taken a picture of her, a large size picture of her, and I had put it in the front seat of my car and seat belted it into place, and I took her with me on this journey to kickstart my next book and stuff like that. But she was there. She was on that journey with me.
I really love hearing that. It gives me kind of some form of comfort. I have something, as I mentioned about with my mum passing away a few years back. I haven't got the cup with me, and it's this specific cup she gave me, Doug, and it's so sentimental to me. And I can't remember exactly the words on it, but every time if I'm going through some rough patches in life, I don't know why, I just grab a cup, fill the cup up with my coffee, I drink it, and 9 times out of 10, it's mum's message to me. So as you can imagine, there's that kind of triggering of kind of like, oh, she's showing up in some sort of way, and I really find that really lovely to hear that you found your comfort of taking Deborah with you with the photograph, and, that comfort that we have. So, I can really feel that, and that kind of, most important, that comfort which helped you through that. And I mean, again, gone through all that, and we're obviously currently working on that. As you know, when it comes to grief or loss, whether I don't think we ever get over these things, but we learn to work with that and kind of fill the gap, so to speak, the best we can to help us grow and move forward. So, with the book Grief, it is one I've got to purchase this book. I've read through some of your other ones, but I'm really keen to read this one. As you know, grief is, not only my life experience, but a good part of my practice. And, grief, the silent pandemic. I mean, your latest book describes grief as universal, but it also explores how misunderstanding can contribute to people feeling isolated and without the support or even the tools they need. So why why pandemic?
Big thing is that there's so much grief going on all around us, and we haven't. It's like COVID. We haven't recognized that it's reached a pandemic state, and so hence I thought, okay, let's grief is the issue. And Grief the Silent Pandemic is I'm trying to get a message to us all that if we don't deal with this soon, it's going to reach that pandemic state.
Yeah, it's not only what I hear over there, and it's made me keen more to read the book of that kind of silent depression and loneliness we have. And it, again, as we know, when it comes to suicide rates, especially with males globally as well, it's growing to a completely shocking rate. And again, why silent? What are people suffering with silently?
Just the whole aspect of grief. Like if we don't have to talk about it, it doesn't happen, supposedly. And so that's why, I went with the silent pandemic kind of idea or concept.
I really like that, and it's really interesting. I had an amazing grief coach on previously, Brianna, who's a life coach. She's a trained social worker, and she had so much loss about her life, including both parents. And what we spoke about as well in regards to about grieving. Do people stop speaking, or does everybody else eventually stop asking? What was really interesting, what Brienne highlighted there, and through my own personal journey, is that I found within my own personal experience of people passing on, is that I was pretty much out there on my own. And where now I have more of an understanding, instead of me kind of thinking that people are abandoning me and they don't care, it's more of the flip side of thinking, well, how much can they digest? How much can they process on this side? So I find it really interesting that with myself, I'm not going to lie, through a lot of the grief and loss I had, far from like therapy or any professional support I have, when it come to within my personal life, there generally wasn't many people around, which again, the loneliness and that side of it is one of the most heartbreaking things I think I've ever experienced. And do you feel that people kind of tend to stop asking, or stop speaking and shut themselves down, or do you, or does everybody kind of else eventually stop asking that question, if you like, especially if somebody's been through a loss or grief? Would you find people do stop speaking, or people generally stop asking?
I think it's how you approach them will determine, the course of action that they will take. So, because what I try to do is I try to use my mentoring processes to be able to help someone feel comfortable. So I want to create a safe place for a conversation to take place. And once I do so, then it becomes that much easier for them and for me to have that conversation.
I love your approach on that. It's more of a kind of lay it out in front of you and directively, how can we work through that? I really like your approach there, Doug. I find it fascinating. And again, with all your mentoring experience, your life experience, decades and years of experience you've had to go through on this, what did personal bereavement teach you that decades of mentoring simply couldn't?
There's not a lot of difference. Even if you add leadership into that as well, it's that we need to have the ability to listen and hear what the other person is wanting to say. We need to create safe places for those conversations to take place. And it's okay to come out of the closet and say, I need help. Reach out and extend your hand and say, I need help. I'm really having a bad day. And know that somebody's going to be there for you.
It's one of the bravest steps of many of us will be able to take. I can really relate to being in that space sometimes and reaching out to have, luckily, like you and I had the confidence to be able to do that. And kind of, again, thanks for answering that, Doug. And do we make, again, this is what I hear on social media, because I've been on social media for the last few years promoting my work and that side. And there's good and bad in all, as we know. And some of the, as therapists don't give advice, but when I've heard some people out there who've got some lived experience and they're chucking out this this advice, especially when it comes to grief, as kind of something to fix. Do we make a mistake when we treat grief as something somebody needs to recover from rather than something they might gradually integrate?
Yeah, that definitely is a mistake. You need to accept the fact that grief, there is no end, and that we need to be able to. The best thing, like I said earlier, the best thing we can do is to provide that safe place for somebody who is grieving, that they can go to that safe place and reach out and ask for help, and know that the help is going to be there. So those are the sort of the key things that I usually try to get people to wrap their head around and think about.
Again, I would really like your approach and how you're doing it. You kind of approached in slightly opposite to myself, which I find really fascinating. Your ideas are already there, Doug, for them to work with. I really find that fascinating with you there. I mean, again, this is kind of like an open question, which I hear again a lot through social media, whether it's grief, whether it's relationship breakdowns, friendship endings. Do we move on or do we learn to carry grief and love differently?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we not so much move on, but we know that every day is a new day and we have to take steps to get through this day to be able to get the help that we need in order for us to have that journey.
Sure. And again, coming from a men's perspective, if you like, again, I've got no problems with female clients and none whatsoever. And because I work less dominating from male to male as well. Did being a man, because again, similar, we don't show our emotions, you suck it up, buttercup, you get on with it. I mean, did being a man affect how you believed you're supposed to grieve at all?
Um, it didn't impact me as much as it does others, and I think a large part of that is because of who I am as a person. I'm, somebody that has lots of emotion and is able to deal with that sort of thing, is to be able to provide that support and guidance that's needed. So
Yeah, sure. Sounds like obviously you put the work in there as well, Doug, and I love hearing that. As you know, when we start that journey and this understanding, I mean, you know, some men have plenty of language for either anger or stress, but perhaps not always for kind of like, for example, I'm frightened, I'm lonely, I miss her. We don't tend to highlight that stuff in society of men, if you like. It's what I've said to some of my clients. We have that stigma sometimes, and I think it's getting better throughout time, but we still have that stigma where I explain to some of my clients, especially when it comes to more kind of grieving the ending of a relationship than somebody passing on. And it's what I always say to them, how many times have you gone to like the pub, for instance, or the bar you meet your mates and gone in there and asked everyone's okay? Do you really go there and say, do you know what? I'm heartbroken, I'm sad, I'm lonely, I'm scared. And I always highlight that to people. And I said, 9 times out of 10, we don't. But I said, the hardest discovery we can have is when we sit through them ourselves. I said, that is, as I say to most blokes with therapy, especially if they haven't come to therapy before, that's probably one of the bravest things many males can take, because we taking it back to your earlier stages, how you tried looking for your answers at the bottom of your bottle. I mean, like me with my substances or traveling, I thought I'd find my answers out there. We can suppress this, but learning to sit with those brave, scary feelings is such a transition for any male to make. And it sounds like obviously you was doing that and growing with that at that time. I mean, how would you, because obviously you got so much experience with your mentoring and your experience. If you don't mind me asking, how did losing Deborah change how you mentor? Are you more comfortable sitting with somebody when there isn't kind of like an intermediate answer. I think we answered some of this earlier, but would you say you're more
Yeah,
comfortable?
I would say yes. It's because I'm holding on to who she was and making that a part of who I am now, so that, and it's also the aspect of, that way there I keep her image alive as much as I possibly can as well. I could choose to not do that and just try and struggle and deal with things on my own, but I would lose touch or lose, yeah, lose touch is probably the best way. I would lose touch with who she was and what she meant to me if I didn't do what I'm doing.
It's like what we spoke earlier, didn't we, in regards to lived experience in the academic and kind of having both. I mean, it's hell of a lot of growth you've had to do there, and acceptance. Again, I think I spoke earlier about. I'm a really big fan of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, and that big hard pill to swallow. I always say to people, when we do start getting to that sort of acceptance stage, that they are no longer around, but we have to work with life without. I said acceptance is probably one of the hardest pills to swallow. And I'm not saying in a way of saying, do you know what, Doug, you have to accept this, time to move on. It isn't that at all. It's more about how we process that and how we work around that without that person around anymore. And that's one of the hardest things for any of us to be able to do. And I mean, kind of if we look at kind of imagine kind of somebody opens a book at 2 o'clock in the morning, they can't sleep. Everybody thinks they're coping. They don't need another theory. They kind of question the need to feel alone. I mean, what do you want them to feel, Doug? Because I mean, many of us have been in that position. Not to learn, if you like, to feel. I mean, what do you want them to feel with this when they're going through this and processing this at the moment? Somebody understands something of what this feels like.
If you can imagine, you can imagine that every person in the world today could provide you with love, safety, compassion, all of those things, that would be the place that you would want to be, and you can get there on your own. You don't need to sit by the wayside and kind of wait for somebody. Is reach out and ask for help, and talk about what it is, where you want to go and how you think you want to get there, and they will walk with you to get to that place.
Again, I can imagine you so good at your work, Doug. Just hearing what you say, and I will really keep in contact with you because I'd love to pick your brain more about the
Yeah,
mentorship side. It's one of those areas where I think I've thought about, and this, when you go through this life, it's like these little gaps. I've got chunks of gaps in my journey and not quite there, and I'd love to pick your brain with some of these. And I mean, what would you tell Doug, another Doug who's out there? I mean, what would you tell that person who unfortunately have just lost their wife? I mean, what would you tell Doug, if you like, who's at the time just lost their wife?
the most important part of the message is that, number one, it's okay to cry. Number two is that there is no start and end date for grieving, that it goes on, for however an extended period of time, and that you need to feel comfortable being able to reach out and asking for help, because that's the most critical part of the healing journey, is asking for help, and knowing that when I do reach out, that there's going to be somebody there.
Yeah, it's really moving. Again, I can only imagine how good you are and your lived experience as well, and your professionalism, Doug, has come across so mind blowing. I'm so grateful for your time on this. And again, answer this if you like, or if you don't. Again, I think I push my luck sometimes with my guests. I mean, well, if you could tell Deborah what you do now, excuse me, what you're doing now of your career, what you're doing moving forward, what you're doing with being such an inspiring guy here. If you don't mind me asking, what's the first thing you if you could tell Deborah, what's the first thing you'd tell her?
that I love her. Yeah, that I love her dearly and I miss her. And she needs to know that in everything I do, everything I say, everything I touch, it's in remembrance of her.
I had a feeling you'll be the one which got me, Doug. No one's done that to me. They did in one of my other podcasts. I mean, sincerely, hand on heart, thank you so much for, this deeply personal. God, you got me, Doug. Damn, guys. I've done it. I mean, I know that's deeply personal to you, and again, it's more my feelings moving. You can tell I've got that stigma of male now. Oh my God, the therapist has showed emotion. These are truly deep emotions and very moving, and I know it's deeply personal to you, and I really do appreciate you trusting this space to have answered that. Thank you so much. And I mean, if we have a look at kind of rapid reflection, if you like, we've got grief going on, love, loss, marriage, family, love, loneliness, vulnerability, PTSD, on your wife and Doug as well. And I've got one final question to ask you, Doug, because I know I'm running plenty of your time in. I'd speak to you all day if I could. I mean, somebody listening has spent their whole day functioning, work, messages, smiling. They told people, yeah, I'm okay. Now the door's closed and nobody's watching. They're not okay. And the person they desperately want to speak to is the one they can't call. Underneath everything is this how I'm going to feel forever? I mean, so let's forget the books, forget the mentoring, forget the professional language that we use sometimes. One human being who has experienced loss speaking to another human being currently inside it. What do you want that person to know?
You know, the most important thing that you could understand is that there are good days and bad days, and you need to embrace both the good and the bad. And what's most important is that you don't you are not alone. You need to understand you are not alone and that you need to reach out and ask for help, support, and guidance. And there will always be somebody there because you are you are somebody that is deserving of nothing but the best. And I encourage you to make sure that you reach out and get nothing but the best.
Thank you, Doug. Again, I so don't want this to end. I really don't. And thank you, Doug. I mean, I'm going to leave most of what you just said where it is. I mean, I don't think it needs me to explain it. Perhaps somebody listening needs to hear exactly that, and that is so powerful there. And I kind of want to finish speaking really, kind of like a kind of personal reflection, if you like. And I want to kind of finish by speaking directly to anybody listening who recognizes themselves in this conversation. Doug and myself know from our own life experiences that loss can change you. And that doesn't mean I know exactly what Doug feels. And it doesn't mean I know exactly, what you feel. Your relationship is yours, your loss is yours, and your grief belongs to your own story. But loss has taught me that there, are experiences we don't necessarily put behind us and become exactly who we were before. Perhaps we don't need to. Perhaps healing doesn't always mean we're going backwards. Sometimes healing asks, who am I becoming now? There may be strong days, there may be difficult days, there may be laughter, there may be that song which I mentioned about earlier on in our conversation, which props up, the smell, the day, and suddenly that person right there. That doesn't automatically mean you've gone backwards. It means that you're human. We can carry grief and gratitude, pain and laughter, love and loss, sadness and hope. And perhaps the goal was never to erase what happened. Perhaps it's learning to carry what happened without letting it become the only thing that defines on what happens to us next. And if, tonight it feels different, don't demand your entire future from yourself. This minute, this hour, one conversation, one person. And if you're struggling with difficulties, as Doug was saying, difficulty carrying alone, please consider speaking to somebody, i.e. like Doug with his experience and his mentoring, or, trust in seeking appropriate professional support. Sometimes one of the most human sentences is, I'm struggling. And one of the most compassionate answers is, I'm here. So moving on to Doug's books. Doug's books includes The Gift of Mentoring, You Are Not Alone, and the latest book, which I'm really keen to read, is Grief, the Silent Pandemic, and a deeply personal exploration of grief, connection, understanding, and hope. And perhaps the thread running through all three is human connection matters. And sometimes we don't need another person to fix our life. Sometimes we need somebody willing to walk beside us. And, we begin to find our own way through that. So if you'd like to know more about Doug and his amazing work that he does, again, the stage is yours, Doug. I've got all the information to add in the description here. Everything from Talent CCA, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, emails, and everything. I've got all your contact details here. But if somebody wants to reach out and go, oh my God, Doug's story, I want to reach out to him, how do they contact Doug?
Probably if you've got all that, we're pretty much there. The only thing I will add is, on a very personal note, is that you can always reach out to me at doug.lawrence@talentc.ca and send me a direct message, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I possibly can, because that's who I am.
Lovely. And I'm sure I'll be picking your brain. I know we're at different hours, and I'm obviously taking plenty of time here, and I will reach out to you at some point, Doug. I so want to pick your brain about the mentoring, your journey as well, and the book side. Like I said, I'm at that stage where I've got some of this stuff and I'm at the edge of that lake. I'm always going to remember that from you. I'm at the edge of the lake and I'm waiting to jump in, but I don't know where to start, and I don't know if I'm going to swim. So I think that'll be quite a moving conversation with our both, which I'd sincerely love to be able to have with you this. So I really thank you. And first of all, Doug, thank you so much for your moving story. You're one of the ones which has really hit me deep inside here and been, God, so moving for this story, what you told me, and the work you do is so phenomenal. So thank you for coming into the green room with myself, and thank you trusting me with your story. And thank you particularly for allowing us to speak about your wife, not simply as somebody you lost, but somebody who lived, somebody who mad, laughed, and who had habits, history, personality, and somebody who was loved. Because grief conversations can sometimes become so focused on death that we lose sight of the life that came before. And as well as thank you for speaking about your own mental health journey, your PTSD, the vulnerability side of those, and what life can actually look like afterwards. There'll be someone, hopefully somebody, which I'm sure there will be, there'll be somebody listen to this and what you said, who recognize themselves in somewhere in this conversation, and perhaps they're sitting somewhere thinking, somebody understands some of this, and maybe just for tonight they might feel slightly less alone because where we're speaking to Doug. Sincerely, thank you so much for your time with this, Doug. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
I'll be pushing this out to the world as much as I can, because your story's been so moving and so inspiring to me. So I really, really do appreciate your time. And thank you once again for being such an amazing, inspiring guest for the Green Room podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.